Okay, so now we can officially begin. And so this is Buddhism in a nutshell. And this is the fourth of 4 classes. And so the purpose of this class is sort of an introductory to all of Buddhism. So we cover the full gamut from beginning to end of all of Buddhism. So nonetheless, it means that we have to be somewhat a little bit superficial in our treatment, although I try to go into as much detail as I can because it's in the details that you really sort of get an idea of what it is. But this course is, even though it's introductory, is often very helpful to advanced practitioners because it's rare that we get a chance to look at the big picture where we see all of Buddhism in one class. Because usually we're focused on such a narrow little regime that we sort of sometimes we lose track of the big picture and how everything puts together. And for me in particular, the beauty of Buddhism is how spectacularly all the pieces fit together. And they have this wonderful logic where one thing follows another. And so so I actually really enjoy this class because for me, it also gives me a chance to sort of think about the big picture and put it all together. So what we've done in previous classes is we began with the very beginning, a little general introductory things about how Buddhists think, what a Buddhist is and so forth. We talked about the life story of Buddha, who is the founder of Buddhism, of course. And then we talked about how Buddhism spread all over the place. And then we talked about the beginning ideas of Buddhism, how it works. And then last class, we moved on to the Mahayana Buddhism. And just as a quick reminder, we said that the original Buddhism that Buddha taught is now sort of referred to as the Hinayana Buddhism. And well, it's referred to by the Mahayanas. And there's a slight sort of, small insult involved because Maha means great and Hina means lesser. So the Mahayana Buddhists think that they're the greater Buddhists. And the Hinayana are those sort of lesser people. And of course, in modern times, people are more sensitive, and the Dalai Lama changes the language. For example, he refers to the Hinayana as foundational Buddhism, which is really what it is. Mahayana Buddhism is built on top of Hinayana Buddhism. So it's ridiculous to say one's higher or lower. They're all part of one seamless whole. And the form of Hinayana Buddhism, the vast majority of Buddhists in the world today are Mahayana Buddhists. Mahayana, for some reason, was very popular when it spread all over the world to Tibet, China, Japan, and so forth. So the vast majority of Buddhists by numbers are Mahayana Buddhists. The main place where the Hinayana exists is the Theravadins, or the elder, so that the Thera means all elders, Vadins view, so the elder views, so the people who sort of an earlier part, a group of Buddhists that moved to places like Sri Lanka and southern India, and then Thailand, and places around there, around the 3rd century BC, a couple hundred years after Buddha was born. Buddha roughly lived 500 BC, roughly, I think is a simple way of, the dates back then are a little bit unclear, but I think that's roughly correct, give or take 100 years. So at any rate, the Theravadins are there, and they still have an active practice. And the Theravadins in the United States and England and Europe and so forth are usually referred to by Vipassana, which means insight, which is actually part of Mahayana also. We also talk about insight. But anyway, a lot of times in the United States or in Europe, if you hear the word insight, meditation, and things like that, there's various big centers, both in England and certainly in the United States, in Boston, California, other places. But at any rate, that's sort of the layout. But here we're in the Mahayana path. And as I mentioned last time, the thing that really distinguishes the Mahayana path is a notion called bodhicitta. And bodhicitta, as we said, is the wish to become fully enlightened, not so that you have a wonderful happiness or whatever, but it's set up to be that way so that you can help, because you're driven by great compassion. And so it's set up to be for the benefit of all other sentient beings. And so the sort of the biggest notion in the Mahayana Path is what they call, where we talk about self-cherishing or lack of self-cherishing. Self-cherishing is sort of an egotistical point of view. It's a sort of point of view where you put yourself first. So you think of yourself as the most important thing, and actually you see the whole world through this lens. So you're always thinking, what's better for me? What's worse for me? And you're always trying to grab things for yourself, be the first in line and so forth, to get the most money, be the most successful, get everything you can, essentially. And that's self-cherishing, cherishing yourself. And in the Mahayana point of view, the most important thing is to give that up and to turn it around so that you cherish others more than yourself. And as we talked about last week, the irony of this is that in this process of cherishing others, you actually benefit yourself far more. So you actually win in the end by cherishing others. And this is sometimes given in also a terminology, exchanging self with other. And by that, it doesn't mean step into somebody else's shoes or something like that. It just means, in terms of evaluating a situation, always putting other people in front of you. So always cherishing others more than yourself. Okay, so anyway, and of course, this bodhicitta method is not natural to us. We seem by habit. In Buddhism, we actually talk about karma almost through a karmic process. A habit and karmic process you can think of as habit that just extends over more than one lifetime. So we tend to naturally look at the world from a selfish point of view. And so to develop bodhicitta actually requires specific training. You have to train your mind to develop this bodhicitta. And last week we talked about exactly the process you go through to develop bodhicitta. And essentially, it's just different ways of thinking about the world. And as you think about the world more and more closely, and actually in many ways more correctly, you actually over time develop this bodhicitta, and it gets stronger and stronger until the highest form of bodhicitta. In the beginning, it's just a wish to achieve bodhicitta, but in the highest forms of bodhicitta, it becomes spontaneous. You can't help yourself. And it's sort of the idea of, you can, maybe an image you can think of, if you're a mother and your child is drowning in a lake or the ocean in front of you, it's like a loving mother can't help herself. She will do anything to save her child. And so even if she can't swim, many mothers will sometimes even drown in the process of trying to save their kid. And it's spontaneous, you don't have to think about it. And that's the way bodhicitta becomes for a true bodhisattva, a person who's bound for enlightenment. And so, and that's full bodhicitta. And when that happens, as I mentioned last time, you're generating huge amounts of merit, because at every moment you're constantly thinking. And the other notion of bodhicitta is that it's not, you just don't love or cherish your relatives, your kids, your parents, your close friends, whatever. It's actually universal. You cherish everyone equally, without exception. And because of that, every single action you've done when you're a bodhisattva is motivated by that motivation. And so your motivation every single moment of your life is to generate your spiritual life for the benefit of all sentient beings. Sentient beings means with a mind. We talked about these different levels of things, different places you can be. But anyway, we don't need to talk about that. But anyway, the point of view is that, if, as we said last time, if you do a good thing for one person, you generate some positive merit. If you do it for two people, you think, well, I'm generating twice as much merit. And if you're doing it for nearly an infinite number of people, you're generating practically an infinite amount of merit. So bodhicitta is considered to be extraordinarily powerful motivation, and so that's the goal. And like I say, it's generated by this notion that, once you start thinking about your friends, your parents, your kids, it's sort of like, how can you leave those people to suffer while you go off and enjoy nirvana? How can you possibly leave them behind, knowing that they will suffer not only for one lifetime, but countless lifetimes as they're reborn over and over again? And so once you generate that notion really, really heartfelt, it's like you're sort of almost driven toward bodhicitta. Okay. And this term bodhisattva was actually came from the Buddha himself, because when the Buddha was giving teachings, as they're recorded in the various sutras, which are the recordings of the Buddha's teachings when he was alive, he often talked about the time before he achieved enlightenment, and he referred to himself as a bodhisattva. So that's where that terminology comes from, which is sort of interesting. So anyways, so I developed all of that. So now I just want to do just a little bit more of bodhicitta before we moved on to the topics of this last class, which are things like emptiness and tantra and all that sort of stuff, vajrayana. The last thing I want to mention is so you can say, okay, so here I am, I'm a bodhisattva. What do I do? Do I just sit there and and so there is an answer to that in the Mahayana Path, and these are called the 6 perfections. And these 6 perfections are listed as generosity, morality, patience, joyous effort, concentration, and wisdom. And many of these things overlap in a certain ways. Many of these ideas overlap the ordinary Buddhism, the original Buddhism, that sort of the pre-Mahayana Buddhism, and in particular morality, concentration, or another term for that is meditation, actually, and wisdom were the 3 things that Buddha said are what you need to accomplish liberation from samsara. So that was the other notion that we talked about, is that there's sort of different types. Once you reach the Mahayana path, there's sort of different types of enlightenment. When the Buddha was alive, he talked about mainly liberation from samsara, which is what's called nirvana, escaping samsara, the ordinary world that we live in. And with this, as I mentioned before, in the Mahayana path, they noticed that the Buddha was at a higher level, was a higher being. Because many people during Buddha's lifetime achieved liberation from samsara, and they were called arhats in Sanskrit, or arhats in Pali. And these people had achieved what the Buddha had taught them as the main goal. With the Mahayana path, though, the goal is actually to become equal to Buddha, to have another way of looking at it is, it sounds a little snobbish, I want to be same as Buddha. But that's not the idea. The idea is that Buddha is a completely perfect being, and he's more perfect than the arhats or arhants. And so the idea is to reach full perfection. And the reason for that is, again, not so that we're a great person or great being or whatever. It's because we want to best be able to help all the other people achieve release from their suffering. So it's a compassionate attitude, not an egotistical attitude. And again, you can't be egotistical if you're a Mahayanist. Being egotistical is the opposite of being in Bodhicitta or Mahayana. So anyway, that's how that works. And so these things are actually practices that are actually done in almost all Buddhist practices, even the Theravadins. So Buddha, while he was alive, emphasized, for example, generosity. And generosity means not only giving money, material goods, it can also mean teaching, it can mean helping people emotionally if they're in trouble. It can mean any sort of help, any way of benefiting other beings. And that always generates positive karma, which is sometimes called merit. So merit and positive karma are the same thing. And of course, it will, when it comes to fruition, it'll generate happiness for ourselves when that karma ripens. So the other morality was always stressed because that's the only way to become liberated from samsara. Because even in the original Buddhism, if you have a mind that is negative, I mean, the whole point of Buddhism is remove the negativities of our mind. And so that means purifying our mind of negative morality. And the main thing about morality from a Buddhist point of view is it really means non-harming. So, so if you're harming yourself or others, it is going to generate negative karma. And if you're benefiting others, doing the opposite of harming others, benefiting them in some way, then you're generating positive karma. And the other important part of this is people get hung up on sort of, well, what happens? Do I suffer because I did bad karma, or get good things because I generated good karma? And and you can certainly think about it that way, but I think the more important way is that as you purify your mind, you get happier moment by moment. And you reduce your suffering moment by moment in all sorts of ways. So there's all sorts of, I think, hidden benefits of this. And so it's not to be a goody two-shoes, but it's more, I think, because we actually care about people. We do cherish people. As a Buddhist, we see that there's no difference between ourselves and others. And we're going to talk more about that as we talk about emptiness. But there's really no difference from ourselves and others. There's no intrinsic nature that I have that makes me superior or less superior to anybody else. What we are at the moment is just all the conditions and causes of previous lives have all come together to produce who we are. And we're changing moment by moment. And we will always, as long as we're in samsara, change moment to moment. And so there's nobody who's intrinsically better or worse than anybody else. We're all identically the same. And so from that point of view, of course, once you really get that, and in fact, that was one of the methods for achieving bodhicitta, was coming to a deep realization of that. That was the exchanging self with other method. Once you really get that really deeply, then, you're naturally going to help other people because you don't see yourself as special. And so so that's another one. Patience is another one, which means not retaliating. It could mean several different things. Sort of the one we normally think of is, patience is the opposite of retaliating in anger against somebody that's harming us. But it also has this notion, which is also in the English word, of being able to endure hardship in order to develop spiritual qualities. And so both of these ideas sort of come into play in the idea of patience. And effort is, when we talk about joyous effort, what we mean by that is only effort that enhances our spiritual progress. So doing effort that encourages to develop wholesome qualities of mind. So effort planning to rob a bank is not the effort that we're talking about. So anyway, that's important to you. But this joyous effort really, it's a mind where they say you delight in virtue, where it just makes you happy. And in a sense, like I say, I gave this example in one of the earlier classes. If one very good way to practice is just go around, and when you see somebody, you can be standing in the grocery line, you see somebody in front of you, and you just think and wish as much as you can, may you be happy, may you never suffer, and just try that. It's just a wonderful practice. I do this all the time. It's actually part of a larger practice that Buddha taught, which is supposed to give you immeasurable amounts of merit. But anyway, if you just practice that little thing, just try that and and watch your mind. And if you're like the vast majority of people, you will see that you instantly turn happy. In fact, I think if you're depressed or feeling sad, this is the best thing you can do. Go around and do this practice. It just feels quite wonderful. In fact, sometimes if I can't sleep at night, I will do this practice. I will just, and you can extend it. May all sentient beings be happy. May they be free from suffering. And what I find is that it often relaxes me and I will often fall asleep. but it will instantly put you in a good frame of mind. And so that's sort of an example of delighting in virtue. There is a delight in virtue, and when you do something for somebody else, it makes you feel good. It makes you feel good deep inside, and with sort of a more genuine, happier, deeper happiness than any sort of ordinary samsaric pleasure, good food, sexual pleasure, all the usual sensuous things, which ultimately don't always feel that good. Sometimes you feel a little yicky afterwards. Certainly, if you eat too much, you feel sick. But anyway, these spiritual types of happiness, spirituality can almost become addictive because it feels so good. So in the same way that people can sometimes become addicted to meditation, because in meditation, you can really generate, especially as you go deeper in meditation, you can really generate wonderful, blissful states. In fact, the deeper you go on meditation, the more if you're meditating correctly. If you're meditating correctly, as you go deep in meditation, and the Buddha talked about this, he was saying some of these deep meditation stages are as close as you can get to nirvana in ordinary life, because they're not as blissful as nirvana, but they're sort of heading a lot very close in that direction. And I know Lama Yeshe, who started our FPMT series of centers along with Lama Zopa, he was an amazing meditator, and he used to talk about that. He says, if people realized how amazing this meditation is, it's like they'd forget everything else and just start meditating. So at any rate, so there's that. And then finally is wisdom. It's actually wisdom that actually frees us from samsara. And as I mentioned in my first class, one way of thinking about that is that, think of a young child that touches an extremely hot burning stove, that would instantly generate a terrible burn, and the child would start screaming. For an adult, we would never do that, because in our mind, we know how much pain we're going to suffer if we touch that hot stove. So, so we would never purposely touch a hot stove for any reason. And that's the way the sort of wisdom works. I mean, once you know how the difference between good states of mind and bad states of mind, you'd never want to generate one of these painful states of mind. You just couldn't bring yourself to do it, because you just know how painful it is. And so that's the way that actually Buddhism progresses, and that's at high levels of morality. It's like you almost don't have, high levels of spiritual attainment, you almost don't have to think about it, because you understand how the world works, how the world really is. And so you just automatically do the right thing. And so it's not as though you're doing something because it's a rule or regulation. You are doing something through understanding. And in fact, even the conventional morality that Buddha taught to the monks while he was alive, because he had thousands and thousands of monks who were following him while he was alive, because he was, of course, amazingly inspirational. But of course, these monks were ordinary people, and they got in trouble. They had, they were not perfect beings by any sense, and they were always getting in trouble and causing trouble. And and I think some of them, as some people do, they were probably escaping their ordinary lives, thinking that it'd be a lark to be a monk, and then it became hard, and then they got upset and started creating problems and so forth. But anyway, so while the Buddha was alive, he kept introducing more and more rules for the monks to keep them from getting into trouble. Don't do this, don't do that. And it was done just because to make it easier for the monks to live amongst themselves in peace and harmony. But the interesting thing about this is that these rules and regulations were, as they were written down, they just didn't write down rules. So it's not like the 10 Commandments, where you just, thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. But each rule, as it was recorded, actually recorded the circumstances of how that rule came to be. So if you were a monk, you could go to the rule book and you could rule, okay, you shouldn't do this. And then not only would you read, you shouldn't do this, but you would explain the original circumstances where a bunch of monks got into trouble by not doing that, following that rule. So again, it's this notion in Buddhism, understanding is so critically important. Everything is done for a purpose, and everything is done through understanding. And understanding is the path that enables us to actually go deeper and achieve. Actually, it's what liberates us. Okay, so the final thing about these 6 perfections is that I've listed these 6 things, but in themselves, as I said, they are the same things that almost all Buddhists do anyway, because they're all virtuous, good things to do and sort of follow the main path. What makes them a perfection is they're done with bodhicitta motivation. So that's why they're called the 6th perfection. The perfection, the thing that perfects them, is that in each case they're all positive things that generate positive karma or merit, but they generate huge amounts of positive karma for bodhisattvas because they're done with a bodhicitta motivation. So anyway, the 6 perfections is what bodhisattvas run around doing. Just in case you thought they were just bored or something like that. Okay, so now I should go on to the main part of the class, which is we're going to talk about, well, before we go there, I just want to mention one more thing about the Mahayana Path, because in the Mahayana Path, not only were these notions of bodhicitta that grew up, but there's also a lot of other teachings that, it's been roughly 2,500 years since Buddha was alive. And so over that 2,500 years, there's been, a variety of very deep spiritual teachers in all different countries, in Tibet, China, Japan, Korea, whatever, Sri Lanka, whatever. And these people have often found certain practices to be very helpful for their practitioners. As I said in the first class, the Buddha refused to appoint what I might call a pope of Buddhism. So people asked, when Buddha was dying, people said, please appoint somebody to lead us. And the Buddha point blank refused. And what Buddha said, I gave you the teachings. That's all you need. Just practice the teachings. And so for that reason, Buddhism has sort of spread in a very sort of hodgepodge way. As it hit each different country added its own country sort of coloration. So each country would sort of make the Buddhist practice sort of consistent, or, they would explain it in ways that would fit with their country. And in fact, that's what Buddha sort of really encouraged even when he was alive. He wanted you always adapt the Buddhist teachings to the people and make it so you understand it. So the Buddha never used the intellectual language Sanskrit, even though as a highly educated prince, he knew it clearly. He always used the local language because Buddhism is for everybody. And in fact, Buddha always said I taught you all you need to do, and I have not hidden anything from you. I didn't have secret teachings that I gave to a few special disciples or whatever. The term he used is that he was not close-fisted, which is, I guess, must be an idiom of India. But anyway, he's saying I wasn't, hiding anything. It's like I taught you everything you need to do, and so you should practice according to the Dharma teachings that I gave you. Is basically what he said. So for that reason, the practical result of all of that was, since there's never been any Pope of Buddhism, Buddhism was never like the Catholic Church, where you had this one cohesive religion with a guy at the top setting all the rules. It's always been sort of, different inspirational teachers would go off and they would collect other people around them who would follow them because they were so inspirational. And through that practice, a lot of times these special teachers, being amazing people, would develop wonderful special practices that they found helpful for themselves, and they would teach their disciples. And in Buddhism is always sort of a very practical sort of thing. It's like whatever is beneficial for somebody, that's okay. So and so for that reason, that's why Buddhism looks on the surface so completely different in all of its different forms Zen is very austere. Tibetan has huge amounts of ceremony and so forth. And just part of that is because the Tibetans love ceremony. They loved it before Buddhism came along, so they just continue to love it even after Buddhism came along. And Zen, Zen has these very austere but very beautiful temples and Zen gardens and so forth. Inspired a lot of Steve Jobs, who was developing the Apple, which is why a lot of the Apples have often had these amazingly sleek and simple designs, but very beautiful. But at any rate, so you should just be aware of that. But one really amazing teaching in the Mahayana Path that I think is well worth mentioning, even in this sort of, there's thousands of these different things, but one that's very powerful is one that in the Tibetan tradition is called lojong. Sometimes it's called mind training. And the simple way is called taking and giving. And I think it really exemplifies how the Mahayana Path works. So I think it's worth just mentioning very briefly. And it's worthwhile getting more detailed teachings on how to do this. And I myself, often at very difficult times of my life, have found this to be the most helpful teaching of all. And basically the way it works is it works through imagination, which we will find is also important in the Tantric path, which has huge amounts of visualization. So visualization can be very beneficial in your practice. And so in this taking and giving, what it is that you can pick a specific condition. For me, the way I used it most heavily is at the beginning of a retreat. I developed a condition called gallstone pancreatitis. A little stone fell out of my gallbladder, blocked all my important passageways that send the stomach juices to the stomach. And they all started backing up, attacking my kidneys and all this other stuff. And it's sort of a condition that's extremely painful and can actually kill you. I also went into intensive care. I spent a week in the hospital before recovering. But while I was there, because I was in a spiritual frame of mind, having started this spiritual retreat, I did 2 spiritual practices. One was the practice of patience, patiently accepting everything that was happening to me and never complaining, never getting upset about it. And it's said that in the Tibetan tradition, it's said that if you practice patience, whatever bad karma is inflicting you will be gone forever after that. You'll burn it up by patient acceptance. So it's considered to be a very good path. So that was the one thing that I practiced, and this stuff was really painful. I was taking these painkillers that were 80 times more powerful than morphine, and it was still painful. So, and I was, quite frankly, I was probably delirious a lot of the time. But at any rate, the other practice I did was this taking and giving. And what this taking and giving is in the example that I'll use here, I imagine all the other people in the world that had pancreatitis, and I imagined taking all of their suffering upon myself. And you do this in the form of visualization. You visualize all of their suffering in the form of black smoke leaving their bodies, coming in through the tops of your head, coming down into your heart, and destroying the self-cherishing in your heart. And you imagine as you do this that you actually really are taking away their pain and suffering, and you feel extremely happy. So that's the taking part. And it's often done in condition with breathing. So with an in-breath, you're sort of sucking in all this stuff. And then with an out-breath, you imagine generating white wisdom light, blessings that go out to them and give them all your happiness and joy. And you imagine yourself as, as the happiness, the spiritual happiness and joy. And so you're replacing your suffering with spiritual happiness. And you repeatedly do this. And so this sounds very odd. And you think, well, it really doesn't do very much. But it actually is amazingly powerful. In the early days, when this was first developed, there were monks who were using this to cure leprosy. There were some monks who were helping lepers, and they were actually teaching this practice. And I noticed that some people were recovering who were doing this practice. And it's a deep form of bodhicitta, if you think about it, a deep form of exchanging self with other. Another example where I use this is my youngest daughter went skiing, and in the middle of a snowstorm got lost on a mountain. And so she spent the whole night on the ski mountain. And, at this altitude, 10,000 feet, people often die of exposure. And so at the time, I wasn't sure. But anyway, that was another time when I was practicing taking and giving. So I imagined all the other parents around the world who perhaps their kid is dying or may have died, and imagine taking on all of their suffering and giving them all of my happiness. And I think in this example, it turned out she was fine. She was actually a ski instructor at the time, and she had gone down the wrong side of the mountain and entered a sort of a forbidden part, which is part of the water system, drains into the water system of Santa Fe. And she and her friend followed a stream, hiked off, they had to throw away their skis. They hiked off the mountain all the way down the mountain, nearly into Santa Fe, and saved themselves. And they spent the night in a snow cave. They figured out that they should dig a snow cave to keep themselves from dying of exposure. So they actually saved themselves, so they were fine. And she was unharmed. But nonetheless, what this taking and giving did in this example was it takes away all of your selfish cherishing of yourself. Because when you're imagining something bad happens to you, you think about, oh, woe is me, it's so terrible, I'm suffering this terrible thing. And you just think about yourself and how terrible it is for you over and over again. And as you repeat that in your mind, you just feel worse and worse until you're, half dead with worry. Whereas when you do this taking and giving, what you're doing is you're changing it. You're focusing it on the suffering of others. There's all these other people who may be suffering far worse than I. Can I take away their suffering? And by doing that, it gets you out of that rut. You stop thinking about yourself. So that's the first benefit that occurs, is that you actually calm yourself down, and it takes away a lot of the agony and mental grief and suffering that you would otherwise suffer. And at the same time, because you are being compassionate to large numbers of other people, you're generating enormous merit. In this case where my daughter was missing, I was able to fall asleep and woke up the next morning. So it's a very, very powerful technique. And so I suggest learning it. I found it, at times of deep need, it really helps destroy your self-cherishing. And it just is such a huge positive practice. So anyway, so that is an example, and that is a Mahayana practice. And that is also an extension of Mahayana practice. So we'll do that. So the other extension that we're going to talk about, not quite yet, is going to be Tantric, because Tantric Buddhism is also a Mahayana practice. In fact, you can't do Tantric. Sometimes it has different names, Tantra, Vajrayana, different names. But all of these practices require bodhicitta motivation. So they are clearly a Mahayana practice. Okay, but before we get to that, I want to talk about one last thing, because we want to talk about the higher levels, at the very end, when you're coming close to achieving enlightenment. So how does that really work when you reach the higher level stages? And I think the wonderful thing about Buddhism is it actually explains the full path from the very beginning, when you're a beginner, all the way to the last stages of bodhicitta, the last stages of enlightenment. What are you actually doing? What do you need to accomplish at each stage? And what practices do you need to develop in order to accomplish that? So in a certain sense, in Buddhism, if you don't become enlightened, it's your own fault, because the Buddha told you everything you needed to do step by step. Even each little, of course, I'm only giving you a broad brush here, but, there's courses that go into far, far more detail of exactly the sort of things, the ways of thinking, the sort of practices you do, and so forth. But anyway, what I want to talk about now is emptiness. Which is part of, and the other things I was talking about, it comes under the category, emptiness comes out of the category of wisdom. And in the beginning, I talked about the Four Noble Truths as being the deepest truth of Buddhism. And so the Four Noble Truths, again, were the noble truth of suffering, that there's all the suffering that happens. And the second one is that there's a cause of suffering, which is our delusions or afflictions, which create all our negative karma, all these negative states of mind. And because once you realize that cause, you realize that there's a cessation of suffering. So if you can remove these causes, then you can remove all of your suffering. And the Buddha said, actually, you can accomplish this. And I know it because I did it. So it's, and you can, and the fourth final truth, as the Buddha said, he said, it wasn't an accident that I did this. I followed a certain method or path that led me to accomplish this. And if you follow that same path that I followed, you will create the same causes and conditions to achieve the cessation yourself, and you will become enlightened. And so, and the Buddha actually many times said that the main purpose of him being here is to actually teach you that path. And the reason, and the Buddha also said that he can't wave his hands and bless you and have you achieve enlightenment that way, because really the reason we aren't enlightened is because of the negativities of our mind, which are these delusions, afflictions. The three main being delusions or ignorance is one, being greed or lust is a second, and hatred or enmity is sort of the third. And so the Buddha said, you have to do it yourself because only you can change your mind. And when you change your mind and remove these negativities of your mind, if you can completely obliterate these three negativities for all time, then you will be, that's what enlightenment is. So it's a perfectly pure mind that has removed all, so only has positivity in itself. It's a purely positive mind. And so the way, as I said before, the way you achieve this is through wisdom. And the highest wisdom in the Mahayana Path is called emptiness. In the earlier Buddhism, when Buddha was along, sometimes he used the word selflessness. And they're really the same. And there's some more details, there's some other ways of discussing this also, which the Buddha taught, sometimes referred to as dependent origination, which is following the process of change. And how, what is the process? Basically, it's a process of change by how you can specifically see how you were bound to samsara. And essentially, it's our own mind that keeps us bound to samsara. And when you see the wisdom of how the world really works, then through that wisdom, you can release yourself from, essentially, it's our greed or attachment. We are attached to samsara. We actually, if you look deep down, almost all of us don't want to leave samsara. We think it's so wonderful. Oh, you have all these wonderful, exciting things you can do. And we don't see we sort of, we exaggerate the goodness, the excitement, the wonderfulness, and we don't see all the pain and suffering that actually goes along with these things. And it's this wisdom that enables you to do that. Another, in the earlier form of Buddhism, another way that they actually focused a lot on seeing this process of the world as it really is, was a practice of mindfulness. And this practice of mindfulness is just really being aware of everything that's going on. And the best way to practice this mindfulness is in meditation, where you learn through meditation to be an objective observer, where you stop looking at the world, you stop biasing the world in terms of what's good for you or bad for you, but you sort of view the world as just objective observers, like, oh, anger is arising, or love is arising, or whatever. And through that, you can actually see the world as it really is. And that also leads to this deeper wisdom. And when you see the world as it really is through mindfulness, the big thing you notice eventually, if you look very closely, is that the world is always changing. Moment by moment, the world changes. It never stops changing. And that also feeds into this notion of emptiness or selflessness. So we can start with selflessness first. So the idea of selflessness is that there is no self. which sounds to us crazy. But it's because you have to understand what it means. So it doesn't mean that you don't exist and that your friends won't recognize you when you walk down the street or whatever. What it means is that you're constantly changing. So your body is constantly changing. Your mind is constantly changing. And if your body and mind are constantly changing, is there anything that is really intrinsically you? And the answer is no, because there's nothing permanent. There's nothing that sticks there. There's no soul that is, in a lot of religions, there's some soul. And this soul is like this permanent thing. It's almost like a stamp that has your name on it. So it identifies you as you, and it's unchanging. It never changes. It's always there. So it gives you a unique personality. But in Buddhism, if you look at yourself, you see that everything about your body and your mind are changing. And our body and our mind are what we think we are. That's what the person is. There's nothing else besides the body and mind that the person is. And if that is flowing, it's like a river, it's like, and so the idea of a self in Buddhism is that, you'll see a river in front of you and you'll give that river a name, but actually every single water molecule that you're looking at in that river is flowing by you. And a moment later, it's going to be a completely set of different water molecules. So there is actually no permanence to the river. There's just this place where a lot of water is flowing by. And what the Buddha said is that's the way the self really is. The self is really just a convenient label, because there is a continuity to your mind and body. So your body changes somewhat slowly, hopefully. And your mind is much more rapid, but other people can't see your mind, so they don't realize how crazy you are. Because we're all crazy. Our mind just, especially in meditation, that's the first thing people notice. They talk about the monkey mind. Your mind is just all over the place. And most of the time, you don't realize it because we're not that aware of our minds. But if you look closely at our mind, our emotions, our thoughts, our feelings, everything are changing very, very rapidly. And so that's what the notion of selflessness is that there's really no self. There's just this process, if you like. And it's fine to label a process. In the same way, a river is a process of water flowing in a place. We can label it, and it's useful to do that. So it's useful to label ourselves. And so this notion of selflessness continues on into this notion of past and future lives. So what happens is, what the Buddha said is that really, when you die, the only thing that happens is that one moment of consciousness leads to the next moment of consciousness. So there's a chain of your consciousness, what we call a mental continuum, that continues on to your next life, but your body doesn't continue on. Your thoughts and feelings and all of those things don't continue on. In principle, only your consciousness, even your consciousness doesn't continue on, because each moment of consciousness generates a new moment of consciousness. So it's like a string of consciousness. It's really karma that's about the only thing that continues on. So then you're born in a new life, you have different parents, a different environment. Maybe you were rich in this life, maybe you'd be poor in the next, or whatever it is. And so on the basis of that new life, you develop new feelings, emotions, thought based on your environment. And for most of us, when we think about, if you were to tell somebody, who are you, we wouldn't know what to say. So what we usually do is we give a person a little mini biography of our life. Oh, this is who I am. I had these experiences, and because I had these experiences, this is the way I think. These are the sort of emotions I have. And so in your new life, you just have a different biography. So if somebody from this life were to go into your new life, they wouldn't recognize who you were because you had a different biography than this life. But nonetheless, your consciousness has continued on. So that's the idea of selflessness. And that same idea sort of applies in Mahayana Buddhism. They stress, although even the Buddha talked about this actually when he was alive, is that the same thing happens to everything in life. Tables, chairs, everything doesn't have, instead of a self, we would call an essence. So there's no essence to a table. The table is just whatever it is because of how it was made, whatever conditions are existing right now. If you're in a humid environment, maybe your table's a little bit soggy, filled with water. If it's a dry environment like Santa Fe, maybe it's dried out, maybe it's cracking because it's drying out. But it's just, again, it's also a process, and it's born, it's made by somebody. It gets worn out due to wear and tear, and eventually it'll die. If your home catches on fire, it'll burn up and disappear. And basically it's like that with every object. And so it's sort of in some sense, it's a deep implication of impermanence. So if you really get impermanence, or the notion of change, that everything is changing constantly, and the reason why everything changes constantly is because everything in our world is interconnected, and it's through all of these interconnections that cause change. Our body changes because we're interacting with the environment around. We're eating different food, we're talking to different people, our environment is constantly changing. Tables change because their environment is changing. Like if you take a piece of wood and move it from a dry to a moist climate or vice versa, you'll really see how the things change. But because most things change very slowly, and in fact, even if you have a piece of metal, that metal is interacting with the atmosphere around it. That's why iron rusts. It's interacting, the iron is interacting with the oxygen in the atmosphere to create iron oxide, which is what rust is. So it's like that. There's actually everything in our world, nothing in our world is isolated from the rest of the world. You cannot isolate any part of our world from any other part. And then therefore it interacts. And those interactions with other things outside itself are going to cause change. So that's one notion of emptiness. So emptiness is that there's no inherent existence. There's no fixed identity. And this becomes important because, for example, when you think, for example, about enemies, there's no intrinsic enemy. There's maybe somebody who, because of the past history, because of what he said or she said or you said, maybe you haven't got along very well, but that can change. If you have different interactions, oftentimes enemies become friends. Friends often can become enemies. You can say one bad thing to a close friend and they'll hate you forever. And so there's no such thing as an inherently existing enemy. There's no permanent enemy. There's just constantly changing people all around you. And because of that, it helps you develop these notions of bodhicitta and love, because you realize that there's no intrinsically bad people. There are people who have just developed in ways, and they act in harmful ways through a lot of causes and conditions, and they develop that way. But they don't have to stay that way forever. In fact, they won't. Eventually, they will change. And so everything in our world changes. And the Buddha often talked about how important it is to realize that notion of change. And once you get the fact that everything changes, everything interacts, then you realize that there can't be intrinsic isolated objects like a table. A table can't sit there and exist totally separate from the whole rest of the world. It's always going to interact. You put it in a furnace, bring it to high enough temperature, it'll burn up before your eyes. It's not going to sit there forever. Nothing sits. Everything on our planet Earth will eventually, when our sun supernovas billions of years in the future, everything on our planet will be blasted into smithereens, into individual atoms. So nothing will ever exist forever. There's just no permanent thing in samsara. And in fact, as I talked about before, that's what makes samsara so unsatisfactory. Even if you get wonderful good things, you can't hang on to it because things always change. And you can't depend on anything because anything can change at any moment depending on the environmental conditions around you. Okay, so that's the notion of emptiness. Another notion of emptiness that sometimes is used is they also talk about the things that everything is made up of other things. So, for example, a table has legs and tabletop, but at a deeper level, it's made up of interacting atoms and all sorts of things. And that's the other notion, is that normally when we think about an object like a table, we think about it as a single entity. There's just a table there, and the table just exists by itself. It's just there. But actually, nothing is just there because everything's made up of other things. And things are made up of other things because they all interact. Even atoms have deeper parts inside it has a nucleus and electrons, and it has, there's just, so everything, so that's another way of actually thinking about the fact that there's no, we tend to think about single identical objects, and those things don't exist. And that's sort of the notion of emptiness. Within the Tibetan tradition, they actually have very deep teachings on Buddhism, on emptiness. And in fact, they say that emptiness is the deepest understanding that you can develop. And it is, because if you really get it on a gut level, it actually liberates you from samsara. It actually achieves enlightenment. A simple conceptual idea of emptiness won't liberate you. You have to really almost feel it totally, completely in your gut. It has to be this very, very deep understanding. So how do you get this deep understanding? You have to do it essentially through meditation. And the reason why is because you're liberated by understanding. And so you need a very powerful understanding in order to liberate you or enlighten you. And so you need a powerful mind. And meditation is the tool for dealing with your mind, for training your mind, for developing a powerful mind. And you can sort of see it because one image that I think is very helpful is this notion of maybe a magnifying glass used to focus down. You take a magnifying glass, you put it in the sun, and you can focus it down to a little point, even set things on fire. So you can think about concentration as being that sort of focus. It creates this intense focus. And just like a magnifying glass can burn things by focusing the sun's lights, your concentration or your meditation focuses your mind. So it develops this deep, powerful penetration ability to actually see deep into things as they exist, as they actually exist. Okay, so how the path works in emptiness is, of course, you get teachings on emptiness all along. Everything in Buddhism is all done parallel. So even though there's a logic to it and there's a sequence to it, everything we do, we are always doing simultaneously. We're working at all different levels. I think that's confusing to other people because when you lay it out logically, it says, oh, well, first I have to achieve this attainment. And then once I've got this, then I do this one. And that's sort of not how it works. And part of the reason why you do it all together is because each little aspect helps the other. And so they sort of work together. So usually when you're doing emptiness, you get teachings on it. You have people explain it to you how it works, and they give you, far deeper explanation. People have whole, 6-month teachings on emptiness, so they can give a whole course that lasts 6 months. So clearly, having given you 10-minute explanation, you're not going to get the full details. But anyway, I just wanted to, again, in this course, I'm just trying to give you the main idea, just to give you a sense of it. And so you have to go to the bigger courses to get all the details. But nonetheless, so you're trying to learn about emptiness to understand it as best you can, just with your ordinary mind. And usually in parallel, you're trying to develop your ability to meditate. As I talked before in an earlier class, there's sort of two main types of meditation: mindfulness, which is sort of being aware of everything around you. And the second class is single-pointed meditation, single-pointed focus. And it's a single-pointed focus is what is done, what you need to develop here, because you need to develop a powerful mind. For mindfulness, you actually also, it helps to develop the single-pointed meditation, because in mindfulness, it also helps to have a powerful mind. Because if you have a powerful mind, it's more clearly aware of everything around you. So, but in this process, you actually go through a process of learning how to meditate and develop this single-pointed thing. And you go through a lot of process of learning how to deal with your distractions, for example, how to return your mind over and over again to the same meditation object. And in practice, the way you do it is you do some thinking, some contemplation to get a clear meditation object. It can also be a feeling. It can be a feeling of compassion. So you think about all the sad things that have happened, you develop a really clear feeling of compassion, and then you single-pointedly hold it as long as possible. You get distracted, you bring your mind back to it. Sometimes you lose it completely, and then you do this sort of thought process to get a clear idea, and then you just hold it. And you keep doing that over and over again, and over a period of time, eventually you develop an ability to hold it longer and longer. And for, powerful practitioners, they can pretty much meditate 24 hours a day for years. Some of these people, there is a way that meditation almost replaces sleep, which is another thing I could talk about. But anyway, that's sort of the main idea. You develop, and in fact, the deep practitioners, they actually, in their mind, before they begin to meditate, they tell themselves when to come out of their meditation. because they never get distracted. So, it's like, and nothing outside the world, they don't notice anything outside. So they have sort of like an internal clock. And okay, so I will meditate for 8 hours and then I'll wake up. So anyway, so you develop, and this single point of meditation is called tranquil abiding or shamatha. And it's extremely blissful. Extraordinarily blissful. And in fact, the bliss helps your concentration. The bliss and joy and the calmness actually helps you to concentrate more powerfully. So even as you're doing the things, sort of the states you're developing, it's sort of almost, it's like a rolling ball. It almost sort of helps you do it more and more. So anyway, so that's the first goal. So the first goal is you develop this tranquil abiding. And this tranquil abiding is actually described. There are states of meditation that explain it more, but basically it is again, everything in Buddhism is continual. So you approach it slowly, where you're able to meditate for longer and longer periods. And then at some point, it's like you cross some threshold, and then your body and mind feel completely blissful. And you cross a point where essentially you could meditate for as long as you want, and so that's when you've achieved this special state. So it's a very, very powerful mind. And once you have this mind, then you turn, so you develop this mind, but the purpose of developing this mind is not just to have a concentrated mind, but it's so you can use that concentrated mind to develop wisdom. And in fact, they sometimes say that there's a danger in these high meditative states because you can get stuck. These deep concentrations or meditations can be so blissful that you just sort of hang out there and you never develop any more spiritually. And so that's why at higher levels, it's often especially helpful to have a teacher or somebody who can guide you, who can tell you, wait, don't get stuck there. You got to continue on. So anyway, the way it works here is that you now turn this deep insight on to investigating emptiness. And when you do that, you understand emptiness at deeper and deeper levels. And finally, again, you cross another threshold and you develop special insight. And this special insight it's almost like a threshold where you develop an additional suppleness of mind, an even greater bliss. And then at this point, you have a really powerful mind, and you continue meditating on emptiness. And then finally, you hit the important transition, which is called a direct realization of emptiness. And this direct realization of emptiness is supposedly amazing. And it's a non-dual mind. It's a mind where you no longer think of yourself as being a meditator who's meditating on emptiness. It's like your object emptiness merges with yourself in some sense. And when you develop this ability of direct realization of emptiness, then at that point, you are very close to enlightenment. And you keep using this powerful mind to meditate more and more on emptiness. And through this process, you purify your mind. You purify your mind of all your overt negativities. You achieve liberation from samsara. But then in the Mahayana path, you purposely remain in samsara and you keep purifying further until you achieve the complete purification of a full Buddha. And then you achieve full enlightenment, the enlightenment of a full, complete Buddha, which is your goal. And then you are best able to help all other sentient beings remove their suffering. And in the Mahayana path, they talk about 5 stages or 5 higher paths where this is accomplished. So the first path is the path of accumulation. And to achieve the first path, you need to develop spontaneous bodhicitta. And actually, to develop spontaneous bodhicitta, you actually have to develop the shamatha first. So you develop this powerful mind, because to develop bodhicitta, you also need a powerful mind. So you develop this powerful concentration called shamatha first. Then you turn that to bodhicitta, you develop spontaneous bodhicitta. At that point, you're a full-fledged bodhisattva. And this is called the path of accumulation, where this occurs. And then the next thing is the path of preparation, where you start applying, meditating on emptiness, and then you achieve the path of preparation when you attain what they call the union of calm abiding and special insight. So this is where you actually in a sense have this calm abiding, but you're turning on emptiness, and finally you've got special insight joined with it. And this powerful mind is called the union of calm abiding and special insight. And now your mind is like on steroids. It's like super powerful. And then you use that to, again, meditate on emptiness, and you achieve the path of seeing when you achieve a direct realization of emptiness, where you directly see, you spiritually, it's almost like you have spiritual eyes, where with your spiritual eyes, you directly see, there's no doubt in your mind whatsoever, you directly see how the world really works. And you see that it's empty of inherent existence, that everything changes, that there is no permanent soul or self or essence. And then at that point, you keep meditating on emptiness, using this direct realization of emptiness to continue to meditate on emptiness. And through that, you go through this path of purifying yourself, and you achieve what's known as the path of meditation. And then you continue purifying yourself until you reach what they call the path of no more learning, which is Buddhahood. It's called the path of no more learning because nothing more to learn. You're perfect, omniscient being. So that's just a brief description of how things work on the higher levels in the Mahayana path. Again, I can't really explain it, but because we don't have time, but yeah, and what they call the method practices, which are the meditations on love and compassion, also harmonize with all of this, because these meditations on love and it's also this notion that everything in Buddhism is about causes and effects. So to become fully enlightened, you have to generate the causes to become fully enlightened. And to become a perfect being, you have to generate almost infinite merit or positive karma. And so the technique for developing that is this bodhicitta, which are all these method practices of developing love and compassion and cherishing others and generating this enormous merit that bodhicitta benefits. And so that's why it's said that only with somebody with bodhicitta will they be able to achieve full enlightenment, this more perfect form of enlightenment, because it takes so much more merit. And you need the special technique of bodhicitta to generate this this almost infinite amount of positive karma or merit to achieve this goal. Okay, so let me just add, are there any questions before I go on? So I've thrown, again, I have to move rapidly in this class, but yeah, go ahead, Anna.
maybe a bit out the box, but um, there's there's if there's an idea or a scientific fact or however you like to explain it, that time doesn't exist and it is just it's the our physical mind, this mind in our heads, which creates this idea that things are actually happening in an order.
Yes.
Does 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 Buddhism hold with that same
Well,
thought or theory, or because if so, it's like everything's already happened, so we don't necessarily have control. Well, that would be
well,
my thought.
yeah.
Mm,
Well, but Buddhism doesn't directly talk about that. And part of the
yeah,
reason for that is that what Buddha explained when he was alive is he said, you know, these things, this sort of understanding isn't really that important because, you know, the important thing is that you're suffering. And he would use
okay,
different analogies to explain this. I mean, one analogy, which he would sort of use to encourage people to do spiritual practice, is he would say, imagine someone setting your head on fire. You know, if your head is on fire, what would you do? Well, you'd go nuts. You'd do everything you can to put it out. And so Buddha was sort of in some way saying that's our condition. We're suffering. Our head's on fire. You know, we don't need to understand the universe. What we need to do is remove our suffering. And what it is said to be to in terms of belief is that as you achieve really deep higher states, especially when you become a full Buddha, you'll understand everything about how the universe works. But there is, I mean, Buddhism does talk about cause and conditions. Although the Buddha also talks about sometimes certain causes and conditions have to be ongoing at the same time the process is occurring. You know, it's like and so that there is sort of the notion of causality has some flexibility and sort of, you know, and in fact what the Buddha said is that, you know, actually in the way the real world works, it doesn't work that one thing happens and it causes the next thing, but it's more like 5 million things are happening at this moment, and all of them are combining to cause the next moment. And so, and that's why karma is so complex. And that's why cause and conditions are all so complex and so difficult to understand, because we always simplify things. We're always looking for one, oh, it's this one thing that's causing that to happen. Whereas in reality, there may be 10 things causing our current condition to be happening. Oh, let's see. We have a question from TNOS. Go ahead. You unmute yourself.
Yeah. Like much bigger way beyond this, probably. Something that I jotted down in my notes is about emptiness is if we're all made up of everything around us by seeking emptiness, are we not rejecting all that is? And so it's a larger question.
You're rejecting all the what? Sorry, I missed it. You're echoing a little bit.
If we're all made, if everything is connected, and we're all made up essentially of everything by seeking emptiness, are we not rejecting everything?
No, it's not true. I mean, there are still objects, and it's still useful to clump things together into tables and chairs and so forth, because things change actually very slowly. And so it's very useful to clump things together. And in fact, if you look at modern neuroscience, as they look at neuroscience, they say that minds always naturally clump things together. And from a brain point of view, the reason we clump things together is it saves mental processing time. So even though our minds are very powerful, our brains are very powerful, it still uses a lot of energy. And so by clumping into discrete objects, we can manipulate objects more quickly. You know, if you see a saber-toothed tiger running toward you to eat you up, you know, you recognize that much more quickly if you see it as an object, as opposed to little blobs of light and so forth. So it's still fine. It's in a practical sense, it's fine to lump things together into discrete objects like tables and chairs and animals and whatever. And because otherwise we couldn't function in ordinary life. But at a deeper level, we shouldn't be fooled by that into thinking that these objects are isolated and independent from the rest of the world. All of these other objects are interacting with the world. And so it's not that everything is everything, so it's just that the interactions of this clump of matter cause it to be a certain way. And as the environment changes, maybe the properties of this little clump of matter will change. But it's still a clump of matter, and you can still identify it. And you can say, yeah, it's roughly in this area. But maybe maybe it's a piece of iron, and maybe the outer surface is rusting now because it's interacting with a moist air environment around it. Things like that. Or maybe, it's sitting in a furnace and it's starting to melt, and instead of being a solid, it's starting to flow into a liquid because it's at high temperature. Or, so the fact that everything interacts with everything else doesn't mean that everything is nothing, or that, you can't identify things. You can still, set boundaries and stuff. And, but, in fact, everything in our world is really approximate. Every boundary, if you look close enough at a high enough magnitude, has some roughness. It's not perfectly smooth. So things that to our eye level look perfectly smooth, if you looked at it in great detail under high magnification, you would see that they're rough. So things aren't always as simple as we appear, but it's useful. It's a useful approximation to, clump things into individual objects. But you just have to realize that still these individual objects are interacting with the rest of the world and are changing. And especially if you understand quantum mechanics, especially quantum field theory, you really know everything that is interacting. Because, for example, even empty space that has no single piece of matter in it, there are quantum fluctuations. And those quantum fluctuations seem like it's just a theoretical idea, but with modern technology, you can actually go into a laboratory, put that empty space between two metal plates, and it will actually, those quantum fluctuations will generate a force on those two metal plates, which you can measure. And they have been measured in the laboratory. And these quantum fluctuations, so quantum mechanics at a very deep level, really, we have notions of entanglement. We're making quantum computers now. Everything really, there's nothing in this universe that can be isolated, because even if you're in empty space, you have quantum fluctuations, which will eventually connect you with everything else in the universe. So it's, so anyway, but it doesn't, the fact that there is, everything is connected doesn't mean that everything is just a garble, is a mess. Things can still, you can still identify objects, but you just realize that it's sort of like saying there's no sharp boundaries, because everything interacts with everything else, especially through the boundaries. And so anyway, yeah, so there are people who, when they first hear about emptiness, get very frightened, because they sort of feel like emptiness is like nothingness, like there's nothing there. So there is still stuff there. It's just that everything is changing. It's not sitting there permanent and isolated the way that our mind likes to do. And our mind isolates these things as sort of being perfect and unchanging, as sort of little objects we can manipulate in our mind because it's practical to do so. But if you actually look at in details at the reality of how everything works, it's just everything is changing and interacting with everything else. And some things change faster than others, but it doesn't mean that everything is a garbled mess so that there's nothing there. So it's still perfectly fine to talk about a self, and the Buddha in practical senses would talk about a self, So if you see Joe walking down the street, you can identify him as Joe, but it's just useful to know that Joe is really a process, and Joe is changing minute by minute, second by second, moment by moment. His mind is changing and his body is changing. It's said that every atom in our body, I think, is completely changed out with new atoms every, I forget how much it is, 10 years or some period of time. So every atom in our body is not permanent. It's constantly going through interactions with the rest of the world, and it's being exchanged and so forth. So I don't know, does that help?
it leads into additional questions, but
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Do you have another question?
I don't want to usurp the time if other people have questions.
Okay. Okay. So then at this point, we'll go on to talk a little bit about Tantric Buddhism, because everybody's very interested in that. And I think, it's, and there have been some very, I think Venerable Robina has given a whole course in Tantric Buddhism. So we've, there's a lot of things, even with TNLSF that, where there's a lot of courses. And Tantric Buddhism is very deep, very complex, very hard to understand, but also very powerful. It's usually called the quick path to enlightenment. So it's said that, it's like all of these other ways of generating merit and so forth can take a long time, whereas with Tantra, you can generate such powerful amounts of merit and deep minds that you can quickly penetrate and achieve enlightenment very, very quickly. And it involves a lot of special ritual practice, a lot of very deep meditations and emptiness, a lot of visualization, in fact. So it has these different names. It has this name Tantra. It also has, which it shares with, there are forms of Indian spirituality that are also called Tantric practices. But the Buddhist practice is obviously very different from them. It's also called Vajrayana. Yana is vehicle, and Vajra is, Vajra can have different meanings. It can mean sort of, I don't know, sort of the strongest thing on earth, the most powerful thing. So it's sort of maybe paraphrasing, sort of like the most powerful vehicle or something. It is a form of the Mahayana practice. So the Hinayana, the Theravadas don't practice this, only Mahayanas practices this. And it's sort of obvious because it's said that you need a bodhicitta motivation in order to practice it. That if you don't have a bodhicitta motivation, you can do all of the practices, but they won't get you anywhere. You won't develop these spiritual minds, and it just won't work. It'll be like you're stuck. You just don't get anywhere. The other thing that it does require is it does require special empowerment, which is a special blessing or religious ceremony. And so people usually go to, different where, there are places where these empowerments are given and people hear about them and then plan to travel. There's one member of our center a number of years ago who went to France to get an empowerment to do this, but they're probably held in the United States as well and all over the world. You just have to figure out where they're being held. There are different levels of Tantric Buddhism in the Buddhist path. They're usually written down as 4. They're called action, performance, yoga, and highest yoga tantra. So those are the 4 forms. In practice, as far as I have seen, it really sort of mainly degenerates down to 2, action tantra and highest yoga tantra. And action tantra actually happens all the time, many different places. It's been held at our center in Santa Fe many, many times. And it doesn't, well, it's much simpler. Again, you do go through a special ceremony and so forth, but I'll explain that a little bit more. But it's just useful to know when people talk about tantric practice, I think mainly most people are usually referring to the highest yoga tantra, which is the really powerful time. So in Tibet in the old days, this tantric practice was usually considered a secret practice, and it was only a teacher would only give it to a select few students who they thought were equipped to deal with it. because it does take you into a powerful state of mind, and it can even be a little bit dangerous to your mind, actually, if you don't practice it correctly. And especially if you're practicing Tantric Buddhism, then you really want a guru, a guide, a teacher to guide you, because these things are powerful, and like everything powerful, they can be wonderfully beneficial. They can lead you very quickly to enlightenment. But if they're used wrongly or for the wrong motivations and so forth, they can be not so good, and they can cause problems. The most common problem that they cause is a condition which I think in Tibetan is called lung, which is sort of breathing difficulties, because a lot of these mental meditations involve imaginations, and they're very much tied into our breath. And so again, sometimes people practice too hard. They practice for too many hours a day. They try to practice too deeply. They go faster than they should, and they can actually end up causing some breathing problems. And again, because the other thing too is, of course, they're going deep into our psyche. So they can bring up, if you've got a lot of negative stuff, a lot of problems in your psyche, sometimes stuff can bubble up, and that can cause problems also. So it's, and again, it's the tantric practice is very non-intuitive, because it's taking us into a realm far outside our ordinary living. And so if we're an ordinary person, we don't know how to deal with these sorts of things. And so you want somebody who's gone there before you, who's practiced, who's directly experienced how all of these things work, so they can lead you past all of the obstacles, and when you're struggling, can sort of guide you how to correct your problems. So tantric is it's not a thing to be a dilettante. It's a very serious practice. It usually involves strong tantric vows. So when you take these tantric practices, you vow to practice every day certain practices and so forth. And these things are taken very seriously. And if you take these tantric vows, then your practice is not going to work unless you, abide by these tantric vows. So if you break the tantric vows, it's going to hurt your progress. So it's very important to if you want to practice Tantric Buddhism, which is very beautiful, very extraordinarily blissful, very powerful, but nonetheless, it's a serious commitment if you really want to do it. So you shouldn't go into this unless you want to really commit to it. Of course, it takes for granted that you've done all the lower level practices, that you've been practicing, that you have a spiritual practice, that you've been trying to remove the negativities of your mind, that you've been developing love and compassion. As I say, you need a bodhicitta motivation. Again, this is usually for ordinary people. This doesn't mean full bodhicitta, spontaneous bodhicitta. It's very rare for a tantric practitioner to begin with spontaneous bodhicitta, just because, spontaneous bodhicitta is such amazingly deep, attainment. It's very hard. You need shamatha first. You need these amazing things to have that. So, but it's fine to practice with, sort of a beginner's bodhicitta, aspiring bodhicitta, just trying to practice bodhicitta as much as you can, and trying to, as much as you can, when you're doing these practices, to wish to do it with a bodhicitta intention. Okay. It requires strong faith. So faith, in Buddhism, as I talked in the beginning, really means confidence. You practice enough, so you say, okay, yeah, I've done this. This really works, and I'm confident this really works. So faith in Buddhism is really strong confidence. You really trust. Yeah, I've seen enough good results from these things that I really am confident that, when they're talking about these things, they really know what they're talking about. So that's what sort of faith is in Buddhism. In Tantric Buddhism, the reason why you need more faith is, again, it's taking you into these realms that you have no experience. And quite frankly, a lot of these things seem really weird and bizarre. And so it takes a lot of faith. You have to be willing to just sort of put yourself out there and say, okay, I trust that you guys know what you're doing, and I'm going to do these types of practices, and I will do them the best I can. I will imagine these things, and I have faith that you know what you're doing, and that this tantric practice is going to work. So that's why it needs more faith. So it takes you into a different realm. Okay, so what else do I need to say? Okay, so it usually involves what they call a yidam, which is a special tantric deity. And there is a whole collection of different, and tantric practice is not one practice. It's maybe like 20 to 30 practices, because there are different tantric yidams, and each different tantric practice has its own sort of techniques, if you want, its own special meditations, and its own separate religious ceremonies and so forth. I mean, they're all very similar, but they were developed by different, deeply spiritual monks, and so there are some subtle differences. So you might do Vajrayogini practice, you might do Haruka practice, and there's many other different yidams that you can do, and so you have to get an empowerment for. So if you want to practice 3 different tantric practices, you need 3 different empowerments to connect with each one, because it's considered that there's sort of a special blessing with it that's passed down through the lineage. So typically you go to a special empowerment for one type of tantric practice, and then you practice that. And usually, I think most people mainly do one practice. Occasionally, people will do several, but anyway, it's just useful to know that there are these different distinctions. Okay. Okay. And so in general, though, in highest yoga tantric, it's said to be that there are 2 general attainments. And this, I think, is common pretty much to all of the highest yoga tantric. So these 2 things are actually called stages. And again, it's going to be this thing where it's going to sound like a sequential thing. But again, in practice, many people do it simultaneously or together at the same time. So the 2 stages are called generation stage and completion stage. And so it's in the normal progression, you would again consider that you would do generation stage first, and then completion stage takes you to a really, really deep level. And so you would think of generation stage as sort of a warm-up, and completion stage sort of the real full-blown thing. But in practice, people usually start off with generation stage. At some point before they've completed generation stage, they start doing completion stage. So they're often doing both together or one after the other. And so what are these 2 things, and how does it work? So in generation stage is you visualize yourself to be your yidam or your tantric Buddha or deity. Sometimes there's a terminology. So for example, Vajrayogini is a female tantric Buddha. And in practice, it means she's actually a Buddha. So in the Mahayana Path, one thing we haven't talked about is there's many different Buddhas. So in the original Buddhism, there was only one Buddha. Although in practice, Buddha talked about previous Buddhas. In the original form of Buddha said that, I'm the Buddha for this age. Eventually, the Buddhism will die out. And then at some future point, another Buddha will come and enlighten the world and teach Buddhism again. And in fact, Buddha talked even about in his previous lives having lived at the time of previous Buddhas. So there even in the original form of Buddhism, there were more than one Buddhas. But in the sort of the original form of Buddhism, it's sort of like once Buddha Shakyamuni achieved nirvana, full enlightenment, when his body died, it's like he sort of disappeared and you never see him again. Whereas in the Mahayana form, there are many different Buddhas, people that have achieved full enlightenment. And these have names like Tara, Manjushri, and these are often associated with a particular type of practice. Manjusri is the Buddha of wisdom, and there's a Buddha of compassion, and there's different types of Buddhas, and people often will do religious ceremonies and pray to these Buddhas in the Mahayana practice in order to connect with them. And by connecting with them through religious ceremonies, it's considered that they get special blessings, which help them along their path, mainly by, I think, activating their positive karma. And so in this Tantric Buddhism, what makes a Buddha a Tantric Buddha is that, again, you can connect to this Buddha through this special Tantric practice. So through doing Vajrayogini practice, you connect with Vajrayogini, and through that you generate huge amounts of good karma and blessings that help you to yourself achieve full enlightenment. And the way that the generation stage works is it involves also notions of emptiness. So the way that this works is you imagine yourself to actually be a Buddha. You actually imagine yourself to be Vajrayogini, and you do deep meditations. And then once you leave your meditation couch, you try to continue that so that you are always Vajrayogini. And the way that emptiness works is that, none of us are inherently anything, but if we act, think, feel like a Buddha, then in essence, we are a Buddha. It's like if we're fully acting like a Buddha, in a sense, we're generating all of the karma that a Buddha would generate, even though Buddhas don't really generate karma because they've left samsara. But nonetheless, it's sort of that idea. So the idea is that this really accelerates your path. Because if you're acting like a Buddha, you're only acting in a positive way, in a fully enlightened way. So that's how generation stage, and that's why it's so powerful. And then the next stage is completion stage, which involves, that's the thing where you really need faith, because they say that there's a spiritual body in addition that sort of is coalesces with our natural physical body. And there are things where they start talking about channels, drops, winds, and through various special imaginative meditations, you learn how to manipulate these things. And the other way it works is it's said that in the Tantric Buddha, they talk about different levels of mind. So there's our ordinary gross mind. There's a more subtle mind, which is the mind that appears when we're sleeping. And then at very special times, there's a very subtle mind. And in fact, it's that very subtle mind which goes on to our next life. And this very subtle mind usually only appears at the moment of death, briefly, and then it gets surrounded by the gross parts of the mind as it moves to its next life. But when you have this very subtle mind is a completely pure mind. And because it's completely pure, it has like almost infinite ability to focus. It's the most powerful mind you can have. And so you can actually, some people practice Tantric Buddhism because in Tantric Buddhism, you can access this very subtle mind, and you can learn, and if you can access it during life, you can use it to meditate on emptiness. And that's how you can make the breakthrough to become fully enlightened. If you can't do it in a lifetime, sometimes through being experienced with this type of very subtle mind, when you die, you will actually be able to recognize it at this brief moment when it appears at death. And then at the moment of death, you can use it to meditate on emptiness and become fully enlightened. So that's the other way it works. So those are sort of the main ideas of Tantric Buddhism. It's like we're developing these very powerful, pure minds, and with these inner channels and drops, again, we can develop very, very pure minds, which develop very powerful minds, which help us in these meditations on emptiness. And so that's why it's ultimately the quick path to enlightenment. Okay. So now I've overrun my time, so I should stop here. So there's a lot more that can be said about Tantra. Tantra or Vajrayana is extraordinarily complicated, but it's the religious ceremonies, the meditations are extraordinarily deep and beautiful and very, very powerful. But again, as I said, it's a little bit, you have to be a little bit careful with it. And you do need an empowerment to practice. So let me stop here and just ask if there's any questions. I'm sorry I don't have more time to go more deeply into it, but I think Venerable Robina gave, you can probably get her YouTube videos and learn a lot more about Tantric or Vajrayana Buddhism, where she had a full course, so she could go into far greater detail. There's many, many different complications. And it's like they say, there's more than one Tantric Buddhism. For the action Buddhism that occurs, those that are a lower level, and that just involves generation stage, where you essentially, you get an empowerment, an action empowerment Tantra, and once you have that action power Tantra environment, you can, okay, bye, Donnie, I'm going over, she can go. You generate this ability to do the practice while you imagine yourself to be a Buddha. So that's the advantage of Tantric, this action Buddha, is when you're connecting to certain Buddhas like Manjushri and Tara and some of these things, you can do a more powerful spiritual practice with an action Tantra. Okay, so let me stop here. Go ahead, Anna, you have a question?
So just one question. I think in my haste one time, I took the highest tantra
Okay,
empowerment and then a Vajrayogini
yes,
empowerment over on the same weekend. Completely different lineage.
okay,
Was very naive. I didn't really research the teacher, although he is genuine and
okay,
and I believe he's a good teacher. Um, so obviously, well, not obviously, but I didn't continue that practice.
yes,
After speaking to some of my closer teachers in
yeah,
TNL. So how would that affect me? You know,
okay. Well,
in
that's, like I say, in the past, in ancient Tibet, this would never happen because you would be a special student, like maybe a favorite student of a teacher who really recognized your potential to do this sort of practice. So you would only start it if you were really ready, and the teacher would only teach you if he recognized that you were really ready. So, but in the modern world, it's very common for empowerments to be given to thousands of people. And many times, even the Dalai Lama and so forth, many people will give these highest yoga tantric to large numbers of people in the West. And the way it's sort of talked about here is they sort of talk about it as a good thing. So basically, it's considered to be putting an imprint on your mental continuum. And what it's believed to be happen is by getting that mental imprint, it will create the causes and conditions for you to sometime in the future really go back to highest yoga tantric and then really practice it seriously all the way to full enlightenment. So it's considered a good thing. It's considered that it's given you a special blessing that in the future will benefit you. And so you don't need to worry about it at all. It's okay. And like I say, it's like, in a way you should say, well, it's not my fault. This crazy teacher gave it to thousands of people and he didn't check whether we were ready or not. But that's sort of, and I think even the Dalai Lama, maybe I may or may not be incorrect, but maybe even the Dalai Lama has talked about it, and there are, and I actually went to a teaching by the Dalai Lama in Copenhagen, and he taught at these very deep levels on emptiness, which I could follow because I've been studying Buddhism for, decades, a decade or so, and I had many teachings, so I could follow it. But he was teaching this thing to, complete beginners who hardly knew who Buddha was. And I kept saying to myself, why is he doing this? These people must be understanding close to nothing because it's so obscure. Once you get in the deep emptiness, if you don't have some background, it can really seem very confusing and obscure. But I think, again, it was this notion of putting imprints, putting this imprint of emptiness into people so that in the future, they will eventually come back and get it sometime in the future. So it's creating causes and conditions for future benefit. And that is a notion that I've seen in various contexts. So I think that's sort of the best way about it. So I wouldn't worry about it, you know. I would just, you know, and you know, and who knows what will happen to you in the future. You know, our lives go all these different ways. Maybe you will again meet a teacher and you'll get really enthused and you'll go back and practice it very seriously. And like I say, there are these different tantric traditions, depending on different teachers give different tantric empowerments, and actually even different lineages. You know, the Gelugpas give certain, they have their favorite tantric things, and the Kagyu and these other people have other favorite tantric things. And in the end, it really doesn't matter. You know, I think we have some kind of karma that somehow attracts us or puts us in these situations to get involved with these things. And I think it's only beneficial. I wouldn't worry about it. You know, it's not like you've done some sort of sacrilege or something. You know, you're not going to be cursed forever. You know, and then in Buddhism, there is no, you know, there's nobody to really, it's not like there's, you know, I've sinned, so you get blasted into some hell or something like that. You know, it's like our minds create positive and negative karma, but that positive and negative karma isn't because of some religious ceremony. It's because our minds are acting with a negative or a positive intention. And when you were going to this tantric empowerment, you clearly had a positive mind. You were seeking spiritual advancement. You were trying to advance positively. And so since you had a positive intention, you know, nothing bad could ever come of it. You know, you weren't trying to do something evil or cheat or get special, you know, powers that you could use to manipulate people. You know, you had a good intention. You were trying to practice as best you could. So you're fine. You don't have to worry. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I'm sorry I had to rush a little bit to the end. There's never enough time to say everything about this course. And if I give enough details to make sense, then sometimes it becomes very hard to squeeze everything in. But anyway, I hope it was beneficial to you, and thank you all for joining. Thank you very much. It's all in the course now.